start out by thanking Puru and Pinaki for inviting me to come and speak here. So what I'll be talking about is broadly in line with the theme of the meeting, but probably a little bit on one side. So let me just sort of start with an outline of what I'll tell you about. Here is what I'm going to be talking about. I'll say briefly sort of the motivation for what I'll be speaking on. The specific thing that I'm going to be talking about is the behavior of amorphous model glasses, which are subjected to oscillatory shear deformation on the computer. So I'll tell you about that. I'll tell you about what we find, which is an interesting non-equilibrium transition, and I will sort of then go through various aspects of this transition to sort of characterize it as a yielding transition. And a particular thing that's going to be of interest is to look at the statistics and characterization of avalanches that arise in these systems both before and after the yielding transition. Okay, so I'll then talk about percolation aspects, fractal dimension, and very briefly shear banding. Okay, so this is work that's been done by a postdoc at JNC, P. Prem Kumar Laishangtan, and a graduate student, Anshul Parmar. Some of the earlier work was done in collaboration with colleagues that are mentioned here, then at EPFL, and this work has been sort of published in various places. Most of what I'll tell you about is what's contained in this. What you can access is this archive preprint right now. Okay, so the broad scope of work that we do in my group is understanding the behavior of various forms of structurally arrested disordered matter. So these are substances that exist in long-lived states other than their equilibrium states. And these are, like I said, microscopically disordered. Glasses, gels, jammed granular matter are some examples. And apart from the transition from flowing to rigid states in these systems, the mechanical behavior and structures of these states are also interesting and are of relevance to diverse contexts and applications. And a lot of the interesting phenomenology of this transition from flowing to rigid states is encapsulated in this famous jamming phase diagram, which sort of shows a region of states which are rigid with and a transition from these rigid states to flowing states can occur along the axes of increasing temperature, decreasing density, or increasing applied stress. And what we are going to be looking at is one of these transitions, which is the yielding transition, which could in principle happen sort of along either increasing stress, increasing stress at various different possible temperatures and densities.
But this doesn't quite, you have a picture of shear jamming, so I was just wondering how that is relevant to that.
Relevant to? That's a little...
Jamming phase diagram. I've often wondered because...
that's a new
I've even asked Andrea Liu about this.
So shear jamming is something that is not exactly among what they had in mind, because I think shear jamming is something that arises as a transition to rigidity when you apply external stress before the system eventually yields. Okay, so yeah, it's not exactly in this picture. Okay, so among the things that we have, I'll note that in trying to remake this illustration next time. Among the things that we try to focus on, though probably not so much during this talk, is geometric underpinnings of these transitions. Okay, so mechanical behavior of solids, we all understand, is important. Response to mechanical stress is a fundamental characteristic of a solid, and these are usually characterized by various moduli, and that sort of linear response. But if you apply large amounts of stress, what you have is nonlinear response and plasticity. And in crystalline materials, as this sort of schematic as well as real movie shows, in crystalline materials, one understands plasticity through the presence and movement of well-defined dislocations, well-defined defects, dislocation defects here, and these are defined clearly and unambiguously with respect to the reference lattice, and you can sort of observe them. So, however complicated the eventual behavior of nonlinear response in crystalline solids may be, one has sort of a notion of basic features of this phenomenology being understood. Okay? Whereas if you look at amorphous solids, they do not have the regular translational order of a crystal, and therefore correspondingly no equivalent of dislocation defects, and therefore what happens under deformation in an amorphous solid is described in sort of fundamentally different ways. And what is observed is that dislocation mechanisms, you're supposed to see something moving there. It's not a good illustration. But deformation mechanisms involve localized rearrangements, and as I will say a lot more during this talk, avalanches of correlated deformation events. And so one, in order to sort of talk about this, one needs to have a sort of statistical mechanical description, and in particular a good understanding of the nature of these defects. And this is a conceptual challenge that is being addressed by various workers in the field. And of course, it's also important for practical applications of various kinds. So since I'm talking about yielding rather than mechanical behavior in general, what one would focus on is mechanical failure. And as these illustrations show, both for oxide glasses and metallic glasses, the manner in which they break up is of obvious importance in designing them well for practical applications. The kind of physics involved appears in a much broader context. So here is sort of a visual representation of various contexts. So you might have landslides or avalanches of snow, sort of avalanching behavior in granular matter, etc., where one is interested in very similar questions as what one would address in talking about nonlinear response of amorphous solids. Okay, so here's a very brief thumbnail description of how people think about this. The basic idea, as I already said, is that when you apply external stress, there are localized rearrangements of atoms or particles, and these are referred to by various names, shear transformation zones being one of them. And the question is, what happens if there is some kind of a local deformation and in a certain idealized context? This was addressed long ago by Eshelby, who sort of showed that the consequences of a local rearrangement would be long-ranged, and the predictions of his work and specific details are also things that are observed in simulations and in experiments. So in amorphous solids, you do see the kind of long-range propagation of stresses that Eshelby predicts. So the idea is that if you have some localized rearrangement, then you have this event talking to other parts of the system through this long-range field. And so the question then is, how does that lead to further events that may take place in the rest of the system, and how does one then, using that kind of a picture, understand avalanching and yielding behavior? So that's sort of generally the line of thinking. So here is sort of a summary of what different people in the field think about. So the nature of plastic deformation events is one thing. So if you were to sort of look at where this localized plasticity arises, can we predict it? How does it look, etc.? And the nature of interactions between these events is, like I said, an obvious important question. And so if one talks about these correlated events as avalanches, but are these events very different, or they're similar for small amplitudes of strain or stress and large amplitudes? So this is one question that I will specifically say something about. The nature of the yielding transition, is this something that's a sharply defined transition or not? And comparison of what happens in other driven disordered systems. So let me sort of not go on and on. I basically just point out that what I'm going to be telling you about is some answers to these questions from computer simulations of deformation of model glasses. Okay. So what we have in mind is sort of an energy landscape picture where you imagine glasses as being local energy minima in a complicated energy surface, and what one then visualizes is that this energy surface is modified when you apply an external stress. Okay, and this modification leads to the destabilization of local minima, and these are your irreversible plastic rearrangements, and one would like to sort of take that point of view and see what one can learn. So like I said, what we do is I won't go into sort of details of why we got to be doing it, but what we do is cyclic deformation of model glasses, and we use what is called an athermal quasi-static approach, which basically means that at all times during your deformation process, the system is sitting at a local energy minimum. Okay, so you keep sucking out kinetic energy as it is generated, so that the system is always residing in a local energy minimum. Okay, this of course means that you don't have time in time or temperature in this picture. So you're really sort of looking at a static picture of what happens, right? So this has some limitations, because if sort of details of thermal activation or kinetics, interplay of time scales, etc., is relevant for the particular question that you want to answer, which in this very context of what I will address is important. People do worry, for example, about how the avalanche statistics is modified as a result of inertia and so on in the context, let's say, of earthquakes. So those questions, one will have to sort of, in order to answer them, you have to go away from this athermal quasi-static limit. But the basic idea is that this is a well-defined limit case which tells you sort of what is happening purely as a result of modifications of the interaction energies or rather not the modification of interaction energies, but of the landscape in deciding plasticity. Okay, so because there is no temperature or time and we're doing oscillatory deformation, our control parameter is going to be the amplitude of deformation. Okay, and I'll be addressing questions about the yielding transition. So here is sort of a schematic of what we do, right? So if I imagine that I have a two-dimensional energy surface, this is sort of the basic unit of irreversible transformation. I mean, it gets, so if I start from here, as I apply external deformation, the energy landscape gets modified till the minimum that I'm sitting in becomes unstable, and I make a transition discontinuously to another energy minimum. The important thing is, in order for me to sort of make the transition back, I have to sort of strain back to a much larger degree than I initially started with. Okay, so there is irreversibility that's sort of built into the presence of these multiple minima. I'm sorry?
Different colors.
Okay, so these are, I'll come to that in a minute. This is a particular model glass that we look at. Okay, so I think I've said enough about this, so let me, yeah. So we study a model glass former called the Cobb-Anderson glass former, which is a binary mixture. So the different colors are the different types of atoms, A and B. And so in everything that I'm going to tell you, I'm going to look at sort of two samples, so to speak. So we're going to look at glasses that are prepared by an instantaneous quench of a liquid that was in equilibrium at a high temperature, and an instantaneous quench of a liquid that was in equilibrium at a low temperature. Okay, so the former I'm going to call a poorly annealed glass, and it's going to be labeled by this temperature number of 1 in reduced units, and the well annealed glass is going to be labeled by this temperature of 0.466 in reduced units. As I said, in what we do, there is no temperature. So the only way in which the temperature enters is the manner in which the initial glass was prepared. Okay? So the poorly annealed glass is going to have high energies. The well annealed glass is going to have low energies to start with. And then we will see what happens as we subject it to oscillatory deformation. Okay? Okay, so the other thing is I will be telling you about results from simulations of different system sizes, and as we go along you'll see why doing a systematic size analysis is necessary. Okay. I thought this was working, no? Yeah. Okay, so so what we're going to look at first is what happens to the energy of these glasses as we subject them to many cycles of oscillatory deformation. Okay, so here is now a certain set of amplitudes of deformation. Sorry, you can't read the numbers, but this is basically strain amplitudes going from 0.02 to 0.07. And as I said, I will always have two glasses. One is the well annealed glass and the other is the poorly annealed glass. And what you see is that for these sets of amplitudes, you do have some change in the energy. So the poorly annealed glass gets lower and lower in energy as a function of the number of cycles. The well annealed glass doesn't show much change, but at the end of whatever number of cycles that we apply, you see that the two glasses sort of retain their identities and memory of their initial state, in the sense that their energies remain different. Okay. On the other hand, when I apply a larger amplitude of strain, then I find the situation that for a given amplitude of strain, this is now going from 0.08 to 0.14. So for 0.08, which is the lowest curve here, after applying a certain number of oscillatory deformations, the energies of the poorly annealed glass and the well annealed glass have both converged to a common value. Okay? And this common value then sort of remains, and this type of behavior you see also for higher and higher amplitudes of strain. Okay? So for this sets of amplitudes of strain, the behavior is qualitatively different from this set of strain amplitudes, in the sense that the system seems to forget about its initial conditions and reach a common state as you apply many cycles of strain. Okay? So what that means we'll talk about as we go along, but one interesting feature one finds is, if one looks at how long it takes for the system to reach an asymptotic state, that number of cycles shows non-monotonic behavior. Okay? In particular, for these set of states, the number of cycles needed is an increasing function of strain, whereas for these set of states, the number of cycles needed is a decreasing function of the strain amplitude. In other words, there seems to be some critical value of the strain amplitude across which the behavior changes, and at which apparently the number of cycles needed to reach the steady state is diverging.
How does gamma mass depend on the system size and the energy state?
Say that again?
The gamma mass that which you have that divergence, that depends on
Marginally, you will see some data. So there is a little bit of size dependence, but you know, we also don't have infinite precision here because we're going up in steps of 0.01. So
also the relevant state.
I understand. So I'm saying we've only sampled some discrete values. So within that discrete set of values, there is some change because of system size that you observe, but very marginal, right? I'll show you data for that. Okay, so the other thing that we can do is look at how much particles move in the process of this cyclic deformation. And so what I show here are mean squared displacements from the initial configuration that has been calculated as a function of the number of cycles. And you find that for low amplitudes of deformation, if you look at these bottom curves, this mean squared displacement sort of increases a little bit, but then eventually saturates. Okay, in other words, after a point, the system is not moving anymore. When you look at the positions of atoms at the end of each cycle, in other words, stroboscopically. So we look at mean square displacements by looking at configurations at the end of each cycle. Yeah? Whereas at large amplitudes, you see that, which is most clear at the largest amplitudes we study, that the mean square displacements sort of become linear in the number of cycles for sufficiently large numbers of cycles. In other words, if I were to think of the number of cycles as a time variable, what I'm seeing is a transition from a non-diffusing to a diffusing state. Okay, so I can associate with all of these curves a finite slope, which I can call a diffusion coefficient, and if I plot that diffusion coefficient as a function of the strain amplitude, I find that the diffusion coefficient goes to 0 at some finite value of the strain amplitude, which is about 0.08.
So when you say it's linear in log-log, but it's a slope of 1/2.
It's diffusive, yeah.
And so it's 1/2.
Well, this is mean squared displacement.
As the mean squared displacement.
Right. Okay. So anyway, so there's this critical amplitude is characterized by a vanishing of a diffusion coefficient. Okay. So there's a non-equilibrium transition from localized to diffusive regimes. So then we ask the question: what does this have anything to do with yielding? Right. So I gather that the word yielding can be confusing. So I'm using that in the sense of mechanical failure. Okay. So so the question we ask is, does this non-equilibrium transition correspond to yielding? And to answer that, we sort of go back and look at how people normally characterize yielding, right? So here I have a stress-strain curve, and people say, you know, if I look at a stress-strain curve that sort of looks like this, which is the case for the low temperature or the well-annealed glass, you say that, you know, this stress overshoot and a subsequent decrease in the maximum stress supported by the system is an indication of yielding or mechanical failure. And you know, in this picture, you can't say exactly where that happens, right? It happens somewhere here. Okay. On the other hand, if I look at a poorly annealed glass, it's in fact hard to pick out any particular feature which I can associate with yielding, right? So there's no sharp point to identify if one looks at uniform deformation. Yeah. So what we ask is, and the second point, as I said, is that there's a very significant sample dependence, right? So depending on what glass you start with, you have very significant sample dependence, and this is sort of further illustrated by looking at various system sizes and looking at the mean energy drops as a function of strain for both the well annealed and the poorly annealed glass. Now I probably didn't specify what this means earlier when I showed come on, hey, I need the slide in between, or maybe the next one. Yeah. So if you look at sort of uniform shear deformation, if you look at the stress strain curve, the behavior you get is something like what is shown here. You will have sort of smooth branches that are interrupted by sharp drops in energy. So these are the energy drops that I'm talking about. These are the drops which we associate with individual plastic events in what I'm going to be talking about later on. Okay, so if you look at these energy drops, in the case of uniform shear as a function of strain, you sort of see 2 points. One is that as a function of the system size, the size of these drops is getting bigger and bigger. Okay, and the other is that if I look at the well annealed glass versus the poorly annealed glass, the behavior looks very, very different. Okay, and so here is now a comparison at a particular system size, okay, so this I haven't told you about, so let's just focus on this picture. And basically, if I ask, based on this data, if I ask you to identify where the system is yielding or undergoing sort of mechanical failure, it's very difficult to tell. And it's certainly looks very different for the well-annealed glass and the poorly annealed glass. Okay, so so the question that we ask is, can we do better with this by considering oscillatory deformation? Okay, so when I do oscillatory deformation at each amplitude of strain, I reach a steady state where I have a well-defined stress-strain hysteresis loop. Okay, so well, it doesn't have to be hysteresis, but here are the sets of all such data that I generate. So this is now as a function of the strain amplitude as well as for two different types of glasses. So I asked the question, does this help me identify where something like yielding is happening? Okay, so one way of trying to address that question is for each amplitude of deformation to pick out the maximum stress that I generate in the system, right? So when I do that, those are the dots, and you begin to see, and you'll see more clearly, that indeed there seems to be a fairly sharply defined point where the behavior of this maximum stress as a function of maximum strain changes. Okay, so those are, I'm sorry, there are lots of different sets of data, but not all of it is necessary. So focus on the green dots. What you see with the green dots is that this maximum amplitude, maximum stress generated keeps going up till it reaches some point where there is a discontinuous drop. Okay, now this discontinuous drop is a point which we can identify with yielding. It's a sharply defined transition, and the interesting thing is, if you look at the different glasses, different system sizes, even though there are sort of minor variations, you have very similar behavior in the sense that to a first approximation, the stresses below yielding and above yielding behave in a very similar way, both quantitatively and qualitatively, and display this feature of a discontinuous jump at the transition. Okay, so oscillatory sheared states are better for characterizing yield, is the conclusion. And so what is happening as I apply cyclic deformation? One way of looking at it is to look at the energy as a function of the strain cycles that I apply. So here is a case where I start with an energy here, and as I apply oscillatory deformation, what I find is that the system is gradually finding lower and lower energy minima. Okay, this is now an amplitude that is below the yielding transition. If I now look at the same system but an amplitude that's above the yielding transition, what I find is a very different picture. What I find is that the strain value at which the energy is minimum bifurcates and is no longer at zero, and this bifurcation persists. Okay, so the system actually finds the minimum energy to be at a finite strain value. Okay, so this you can associate with the emergence of plasticity, and so this kind of a change in behavior is a new hallmark of this transition. Okay, and here is sort of the cleaner version of this data. You start out with energies for small amplitudes sitting there in the steady state, and it goes down and down and down till you hit this transition at which the energies begin to go up and to display this bifurcation. Okay, and then it keeps going up as you go to higher and higher amplitudes of strain. And it's also interesting to see what happens to these strain values at which the energy is minimum as a function of the number of cycles. And for the data that I show here, the most interesting thing is that when I'm sitting below the yield point, even if I start out with some initial configurations where the minimum energy is at some finite strain value, that finite strain value sort of gets annealed out so that eventually I am converging to a state where the zero strain configuration is the one that has the lowest energy. Of course, like I said, above the yielding, the lowest energy strain value is something finite, but right around the transition you see something very interesting, which is that there is an initial decrease of the strain value before it sort of kicks off and goes to larger values. Okay, so this is now a case where the system sort of initially attempts to find some local equilibrium, but is not able to, and then it sort of escapes to a yielded state which has this larger strain value at the minimum. And this is of relevance to sort of trying to think about exactly how to characterize the yielding transition. There's some sort of recent work which I'll mention later on if anybody asks, which can be interrogated with data like this. Okay, so here is this energy asymptotically as a function of the strain amplitude, and you see that these energies show a clear minimum at the transition. Okay, so one of the sort of upshots of this analysis is the lowest or the most annealed glasses are to be formed right at the yielding transition. Okay, so it's something interesting. Of course, it takes a long time, so it may not be of practical value, but something that's interesting to see. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is avalanches. And Shankar is leaving just when I thought what I had to say would interest him. Okay, okay, so so what I mean by avalanches, let me quickly define. So like I pointed out earlier, when I look at the stress strain curves, I have these continuous branches that are interrupted by discontinuous jumps, and these jumps are what I'm going to be looking at. And so when these jumps happen, of course, there is jumps in the stress as well as the energy, and I will show you some data about the energy drops. But I can also ask, which particles moved during this transition, right? And that's a slightly tricky question I'll mention in a minute. But by analyzing the displacement fields in the system, we identify a set of particles which we call active particles. Okay, so these are the ones that undergo plastic deformation during one of these events. Okay, so if you look at the distribution of displacements of all the particles, what you find is something that's sort of shown here for different amplitudes of strain. If you focus on the black curve here, what you'll see is that this distribution is can be separated into two components. One is a power law distribution for small displacements, followed by an exponential tail. Okay, now if one can sort of understand this by saying that if I had, like in the Eshelby picture, a local plastic deformation, it would induce sort of linear elastic displacements of particles farther away, and these sort of linear elastic displacements can explain the power law part. So what one really would like to focus on are the particles that are sitting in the exponential tail of the distribution. Okay, so the problem is it's not a very sharp separation to make. but one has to sort of do what one can. So we use a reasonable cutoff of 0.1 sigma as separating the active particles which are at larger displacements from the power law tail, from the power law, particles sitting in the power law at smaller displacements. Okay. Okay, and then we look at the distributions of the sizes of clusters that are formed by these particles. Okay, so here is this avalanche size distribution as a function of size for a range of amplitudes of deformation. And what you find is as you increase the amplitude of deformation, the power law cutoff, there's sort of a power law regime followed by a cutoff, and this cutoff seems to move to larger and larger values, and that's good. This is sort of what you expect, but it shows no indication of crossing what I've so far described as a sharp transition, right? So between 0.07 and 0.08, I should see some difference in behavior, and I don't see it. Okay, so then we sort of realized, after staring at data like this for a while, that we should really be looking at different system sizes and understanding the size effects. So here is a much larger system, and when you look at the same data for this larger system, you begin to see that indeed there is a difference between the 4 small amplitudes that are all clustered out here and the larger amplitudes which begin to now show a fairly clear power law regime. Okay, and with an exponent of 3/2. So system sizes are important. This is the same for energy drops. I will not dwell on this too much, but in order to understand better what the system size effects are, and B, how that will help us identify where the yielding transition is, what I show here is the mean avalanche size in terms of cluster sizes and in terms of energy drops as a function of the system size, and each curve is a particular amplitude. Okay, so what you find is that for low amplitudes of shear deformation, the system size effects are basically negligible, right? So the mean avalanche size stays roughly constant. But when you go beyond 0.07 onto 0.08, you begin to see that the mean cluster size has a very clear system size effect. Okay, and so the 0.08 case is where there's a bit of a crossover. So Ranjani, this is what I meant. So if in all the other cases it's one type of behavior or the other, but for 0.08 there is sort of a crossover behavior. So that apart, the system size effects are clearly separated into 2 camps, and the size dependence here is n to the 1/3, and this is a number that has been sort of observed before, including Sharajit's work with Itma Prakacha, and it doesn't at the moment have an explanation. Okay, why the avalanche sizes should scale as n to the 1/3, but the basic point here is that if I what really. Oh, no, I mean, if there's a quick way to say it, you should say it, but I don't, it's the exponent is 1/3 in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, and it doesn't correspond to anything you understand about the structure of the avalanches. So,
it's related to the plastic drop, and every time you drop, there is a saddle node bifurcation that has a square root dependence, and so I guess show you.
No. So you can understand an exponent relation from doing that analysis. I agree with you. But the value of 1/3 has no explanation. The value of 1/3. Why it's related to something else? Okay, then I missed something. But I'll be happy to know. But, oh, I see. I think it's okay. Okay, so but the simple statement about avalanches is that they are systems spanning above the yielding transition and they're localized below. Okay, and I think there's been confusion about this in the literature, and I think this point is clarified. Okay, so here is sort of different ways of sort of displaying the data to make the same point. So I won't dwell on this. The same applies to energy drops, except when one looks at the energy drops, one is mixing the contributions from the plastic core as well as the far field. Okay, and so if you sort of don't take care, you'll find size effects also below the yielding transition. But if you take care of that by focusing on energy changes only for the particles you identify as the plastic core, then you have the same picture of there being no size effect, no large energy drops below the yielding transition, and size effects and large energy drops above. Okay, so here is something again more interesting. So because we look so far at the mean cluster sizes, we can ask, is that sort of a good enough number with which to scale the data and obtain sort of a common scaling behavior? And the quick answer is yes. But interestingly, you have avalanche size distributions which fall on these scaling functions which are different above and below the yielding transition. Okay, so this is sort of highlighted by dividing out by s to the 3/2, which is sort of the expected power law behavior. You see that for above the yielding transition, this s to the 3/2 with a cutoff that is determined presumably by the system size that you're looking at is sort of is a fairly well-defined behavior, whereas the function that describes data below the yielding transition is qualitatively different. Okay, then you can ask whether the mean avalanche size in a given interval of strain values is different or the same depending on what your amplitude of strain is. And the answer is they're basically the data divide out into two sets. There is sort of common behavior for amplitudes that are below the critical amplitude, the yielding threshold, and behavior above for amplitudes above the yielding transition are different. Okay, right. So finally, so we look at the percolation characteristics, and we've done it in a couple of different ways, where either we look at sort of individual drop events and look at the particles that participate and ask what is their percolation behavior, or we sort of look at an accumulation of particles that participate in a plastic event through 1/4 of a cycle and ask what happens to their percolation, and the quick sort of statement is that there is a percolation transition that takes place at the yielding transition. Okay, and this is a little bit complicated, so let me not. So what this is showing is the percolation probability and the fraction that is in the percolating cluster, and basically you see that there is a sharply defined transition at the yielding transition. And we also then went on and looked at fractal analysis by doing box counting, and this is sort of the data from which you can pull out a fractal exponent of 2, which seems to make sense if you have sort of a two-dimensional yield surface, which is what you see, but this is not consistent with this exponent of basically 1, n to the 1/3 for 3 dimensions is L to the 1. So one would, if using that, one would sort of say that the fractal dimension is 1, but that's not consistent. Okay, so I'm not going to show this movie because I guess I should stop. This is just to show how the events look, both below yield and above yield. You see that clearly the much larger events and the system spanning. But let me end by talking about shear banding. If you look at sort of the set of particles which participate in sort of plastic events, now I'm focusing on amplitudes that are above the yielding amplitude. What you see is that they do form shear bands. Okay, and these shear bands are not present below the yielding transition. And if you look at what happens as a function of the amplitude going to larger and larger amplitudes, you see that these bands clearly grow. Okay, so we don't go to lower amplitude values, but still above the transition, but presumably one can speculate that the shear bands are initiated at the yielding transition and then they grow in thickness. Okay, so that's the summary of what I've told you. We have a non-equilibrium transition from localized to diffusive states. Okay, ignore the second part. This transition is a good way of characterizing yielding, and we have avalanches that are distinct below and above the yield point, and power law distributions with exponents of 3/2 above. The yielding transition appears to be a sharp transition associated with the divergence of the sizes of avalanches, behavior below yield at variance with theoretical expectations of uniform shear. What that means basically is that there are sort of theoretical descriptions of the yielding transition that claim that the avalanche size diverges as you approach the yielding transition from below. And certainly for cyclic deformation, where you can sort of hope to see some kind of a clean universal behavior, this statement does not apply. Okay, but to be fair, the statement has not been made keeping cyclic deformation in mind. So some further analysis is needed here. Above the yield strain, the clusters of active particles percolate. The fractal dimension of these percolating clusters is about 2, and you have shear banding above the yielding transition. So let me stop. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, so this is about the jump that you see. Mm-hmm. So you have done this cycling at some particular frequency, right?
Frequency.
Yeah.
So
so you have varied the amplitude but kept frequency constant.
Well, we do this as a quasi-static, so the frequency is 0.
It's a cycle, so.
Yes. Yeah.
So when you do this cycling, so
yeah.
it takes us a certain number of steps to come back.
Right.
So that is there is a time period, so there must be a frequency.
Okay, let's say, but continue.
Yeah. So so as you decrease the frequency, do you see this jump going down and going into the?
Okay. No. So the answer is because you're giving the system as much time as it needs to equilibrate for all infinitesimal changes in the strain, you are in the zero frequency limit. There is no time, okay? But avalanche distributions, other people have looked, are sensitive to effects of inertia and frequency and so on. I mean, so, but we are in the zero frequency limit.
No, I doubt that. Okay.
Okay.
You showed that the minimum in the energy plot happens at zero strain till you reach a critical level. So, I mean, just to understand it from a mechanics standpoint, so if you do loading and unloading, once it yields, you will have residual strain. And is that the strain that at which the minimum is reached? So, the relaxed state would be the minimum in the energy once you go beyond the critical, because it shifts out, right? So, you get more and more residual strain.
Right. So, there are two things going on, right? One is if you're looking below the yielding, right? There is no residual strain, but there is annealing going on. Okay. Whereas but so in terms of where we are looking at that energy, it's when you reverse back to zero strain. Okay. That is no. Sorry, you asked. No, it's not at the residual strain.
So beyond the critical strain, the minimum shifts out, right? And then it's no longer at gamma equal to 0.
Right. So the data that I showed was for zero strain at the end of each cycle always. Okay. But I showed you data which would answer your question, if I can get there. Sorry about that. But because I had the data of the energies as a function of strain during the cycle, and you see that the zero strain value and the residual strain value are different of the energy, but they would still show a non-monotonic behavior if I can get there. Sorry. Shoot. So I can just so the energies. Oh, okay, good. Yeah, that one, right. So, so what I'm showing are these energies: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, but even if I were to sort of show these, qualitatively the behavior will not change.
No, my question was that up to the blue curve, right?
Right.
Which is, up to that stage, the behavior would be fully reversible. I mean, if you do a loading and unloading, then beyond that, it's not reversible. There is a residual strain at which you get the minimum.
Correct. That's right.
Hysteresis, you are getting above that, right?
Yes, absolutely. Correct. Yeah.
If you strain below the transition, do you see aging? Have you started to find correlation function?
So, well, I'm calling it annealing, but if you want to call it aging, you can, I suppose. So this is the behavior you see, right? But so there is annealing of the system with cycles, right? And it is a slow process with a diverging length time scale as you approach the threshold. So yeah, I mean you could call it aging, but yeah.
And besides the fluctuation of the energy as a function of there are a lot of similarities with the tapped granular materials, in which you reach steady state, and there you can study the fluctuation of the energy in the steady state, and do all the thermodynamic formalism. Have you exploring this?
I mean the analogies with tapping.
analogy with tapping.
Yeah. So I agree with you. There is an analogy. But no, I haven't really thought of making any detailed comparison, but that would be very interesting. I think. Because because the same kind of behavior must arise there in terms of the amplitude of the tapping and so on, right? Which is probably
very similar.
yeah. And okay, well, yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? Regarding the last slide, we talked about shear banding.
Right.
You said that it widens. Now, my question is that there are two things that are happening. One is shear-induced dilatation, which is causing it to widen. And also you have structural relaxation due to, which is simultaneously going on, what you call as annealing. So would the shear band width ultimately saturate in your simulations at some level, or it would continuously, indefinitely keep on widening?
So at the highest, okay, so the first part of what you said, it's not obvious to me in the sense why would there be dilatation?
That's the Poplar hypothesis in terms of the STCs, right? When you shear it, there is dilatation that happens, excess free volume is created, and that tends to sort of widen the shear band. And then you also have structural relaxation, what you call as annealing, simultaneously going on.
Right.
So these have sort of balance each other, and then the shear band width saturates at some steady state level.
Right. So, okay. In terms of the answer to the question of what I expect will happen, I expect that as I go to larger and larger amplitudes, the width will keep increasing, right? So at sufficiently large amplitudes, I expect that it'll, because then if I take the amplitude of strain to large values, it's like doing uniform shear. So if you do uniform shear for sufficiently large strain, you expect the shear band to fill the system, right? So, but in terms of, just above the yielding transition, there is some kind of a competition, which like you said, basically, I mean, I don't know how to think about it in terms of dilatation, so, but that, I'd like to learn more about it. But I mean, so the effect of the shearing is no longer simply to take the system to lower possible energy minima, but some of it does go. I mean, so how to think of the real space picture that emerges, I'm not sure. The reason I showed this data is, again, in terms of trying to understand when to expect shear banding. There's, so I think basically if I think of coming, okay, what we did was to sort of at each amplitude start from the quench sample and apply a particular amplitude. But in principle, I could also think of increasing the amplitude slowly, sort of reaching a steady state at each amplitude. And then, so what I would be looking at is for well annealed glasses, shear banding behavior. And clearly here that shear banding is initiated at the point of yielding. And that I wanted to emphasize. Yeah.
Your shear band is very wide. Would you say fractal dimension is still true? Because you said that
At some point, no. But it's, I think, we're looking at finite systems, so you have to, but if you look at a large enough sample, I mean, this thickness is probably, again, one needs to have a way of calculating what this thickness should be in order to answer that question. But
should be like a surface, you say. sample size goes
Right.
to infinity.
Well, I mean, the width of the shear band will not be scaling with the system size, in at least when it initiates. So there it's clearly two-dimensional. Yeah.
So when you calculate the fractal dimension, this will usually depend on how you define your cutoff, define the avalanche particle. So that is some sort of uncertainty. And any other definition will give you a structure which is probably not that compact, and you get fractal dimension probably lower, because avalanches, if you look at, they are in
Yeah,
the picture
so-
in the movies, it looks like kind of a line going through the system.
So obviously, if I use a different definition of labeling particles, I'm looking at a different set of particles and it will have a different fractal dimension in principle. If one had the luxury of a very clear-cut definition of what the right set is, life would be simple. But here, you know, all I can say is that not with the fractal dimension, but with sort of avalanche distributions, etc., we have varied the cutoff a little bit and checked whether it makes a difference. It doesn't. Okay. Of course, if you change it way out, it will, the avalanche distributions will become very different. But that's, you know, you're not looking at anything physically meaningful at that point.
No, but main,
So,
main aspect is
So the question to ask is sensitivity to definition. Obviously, if you really change the definition a lot, the behavior will change. But all I can say is that if, you know, instead of 0.1 as the cutoff for the displacements, if I choose 0.05 or 0.2, the avalanche distributions didn't change too much. If I go beyond, it begins to change, right? But on the other hand, okay, so something that we're trying to do now is, you know, single particle displacements are not the most satisfactory way of trying to analyze this. So Mark Robbins and Salerno have done analysis basically with the same idea as we followed, except that they looked at local strains. Okay, and at least from their papers, their pictures look a lot prettier in terms of defining a cutoff that is clear cut. So we're trying to implement that and to look, but I don't see I mean, there is an ambiguity, but I don't see a serious question about the fractal dimension.
no, but it's related to the exponent of 1/3.
Huh?
So it is related to the exponent 1/3, and it
No,
goes
so-
against what we showed. So if it is a linear object, then it's in both 2 and 3 dimensions, the exponent will remain 1/3. Not 1/3, yeah. So it's, in 3D it will be a linear object, and in 2D it should be even smaller than linear.
So the analysis you're talking about claims that in 2D it's not a linear object,
Yes.
right?